The line at the pharmacy crawled forward at a snail's pace that Friday afternoon, and Hannah sighed as she shifted from one foot to the other. She had a mountain of homework waiting at home, and she was eager to get her mom's prescription and leave. But as she waited, her eyes caught on an elderly man standing just behind her. His thin frame was bent under a heavy-looking tweed coat, his wrinkled hands clutching a leather wallet. He looked lost, and as he peered up at the fluorescent lights with a tired gaze, Hannah felt a pang of sympathy. Finally, it was his turn, and she watched as he took a shaky step forward, leaning on his cane as he handed a small paper slip to the pharmacist. Hannah saw his mouth tighten as he counted the bills in his hand and glanced down, obviously uncomfortable. "That'll be $43, sir," the pharmacist said softly, though Hannah could hear the hesitation in his tone. The man let out a slow, quiet sigh, fidgeting with his wallet. She could tell he didn't have enough. Without really thinking, Hannah stepped forward and offered her card to the pharmacist, her voice steady as she said, "I'd like to cover it." The elderly man turned, eyes widening as he processed what she was doing. "Oh no, young lady, you don't need to do that," he murmured, his voice tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "I don't want to trouble you." Hannah smiled, feeling something warm and sure welling up inside her. "Please, I'd really like to help," she said. "It's no trouble, really." The man's hands shook a little as he took the bag from the pharmacist, his expression softening. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to me. My name is Mr. Saunders." "It's really no problem," Hannah replied gently. "I'm glad I could help." With a grateful nod, Mr. Saunders left, clutching his medication close. Hannah watched him go, a strange, almost bittersweet feeling filling her chest. She'd been so focused on the small act of paying that she hadn't expected to feel so deeply moved. That evening, she barely thought about it again. She was used to helping out her mom whenever she could, but something about Mr. Saunders' gratitude stayed with her in a way she couldn't quite explain. The next day, while she was sprawled out on her bed with her homework, her phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before picking it up, her mind racing with possible reasons someone might be calling her out of the blue. "Hello," she answered. "Is this Hannah?" The voice on the other end was familiar, warm but hesitant, as though he wasn't sure she'd remember him. "Yes. This is Hannah," she replied, sitting up a little straighter. "This is Mr. Saunders." From the pharmacy, the man continued, sounding almost relieved. "I hope you don't mind my calling. The pharmacist was kind enough to help me get in touch with you. I wanted to thank you again. And I was wondering if you might allow me to thank you properly. Perhaps you and your mother could come over for tea." Hannah blinked, surprised by the offer. She had never been invited for tea by a stranger, especially not someone like Mr. Saunders, who seemed both gentle and wise. "I'll ask my mom," she said, a bit hesitant but intrigued. "But I think we'd like that." With her mother's approval, they agreed to visit the next day. The following afternoon, Hannah and her mother pulled up to a charming house in the older part of town. It was a pale blue Victorian with ivy climbing up one side and a small garden lining the path to the front door. The sight of it made Hannah's heart skip. It looked like something out of an old story, a house full of character and history. Mr. Saunders greeted them warmly at the door, his eyes lighting up as he welcomed them inside. His home was cozy, filled with the scent of something baking, and every inch of the place seemed alive with memories. There were bookshelves full of well-worn volumes, photographs in old-fashioned frames, and trinkets that looked like they'd been collected from far-off places. They settled in the living room, where a table was set with a teapot, china cups, and a plate of scones. Mr. Saunders poured tea for each of them, his hands steady but deliberate, as if each movement mattered. Hannah noticed a large portrait on the wall, a beautiful woman smiling back from the photo, her eyes kind and gentle. "That was my wife, Margaret," he said, catching her gaze. "She passed many years ago, but she was the heart of this home. She had a way of making people feel valued, no matter who they were. She always believed that kindness was the most important thing we could give." Hannah felt a tug of emotion, struck by the love in his voice. She could almost feel Margaret's presence in the room, her spirit woven into the fabric of the home. It was a feeling of warmth and grace, a quiet assurance that kindness truly mattered. Mr. Saunders began to tell snippets of his life as a history professor, his travels with Margaret, and his dedication to his students, whom he tried to teach not only about history, but about humanity. He spoke softly, but with a wisdom that drew her in, making her forget the time as the afternoon sun cast golden light across the room. At some point he paused, looking down at his hands for a moment before he spoke. "Hannah, I don't know if you realize how unusual your kindness was," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You helped someone without expecting a single thing in return. That's rare these days." She felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I just wanted to help," she said, feeling a bit shy under his warm gaze. "It didn't feel like a big deal." "To you, maybe," he replied with a soft smile. "But to someone else, it meant the world." He rose and left the room for a moment, returning with a small, intricately carved wooden box. He placed it carefully in her hands, and she looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Inside is something very dear to me," he said softly, "and I'd like you to have it." She opened the box, revealing a delicate gold locket resting on a bed of velvet. The metal was warm in her hand, etched with a pattern of tiny flowers that looked almost like vines winding around the edges. It had an old-fashioned clasp, and she could tell that it was more than just jewelry. This was Margaret's, Mr. Saunders explained. She wore it every day. Inside there's a small inscription she chose herself. "Kindness is courage. I can't explain why, but I feel like Margaret would want you to have it." Hannah's breath caught as she held the locket. It felt like she was being entrusted with something much bigger than herself, a piece of a legacy that stretched far beyond her years. She looked up, trying to find the right words to express her gratitude, but nothing felt like enough. "There's one other thing," Mr. Saunders added, his voice filled with a gentle urgency. "I know you're still in high school, but someday soon you'll be thinking about college. I'd like to help you get there. Margaret and I never had children, and we saved for years with the hope that one day we'd be able to help someone in need." Hannah's heart skipped. "Mr. Saunders, I couldn't possibly." "Please," he said, his gaze kind but insistent. "Allow me to do this. Consider it a gift, not for what you did for me, but for the person you are." Her mother looked at her, eyes shining with pride and surprise. "That's an incredibly generous offer," she said softly, placing a hand over Hannah's. "It's a rare opportunity, Hannah." Tears stung Hannah's eyes as she tried to take in everything he was offering: the chance to go to college without the worry of financial strain, the gift of the locket that carried Margaret's memory, and the weight of knowing someone believed in her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, voice choked with emotion. She looked down at the locket, feeling its reassuring weight in her hand. I promise I'll make the most of it. And I'll carry her kindness forward, just like she did." Mr. Saunders nodded, his face softening into a peaceful smile, as if he'd been waiting to hear those very words. The weeks passed, and though life resumed its familiar rhythms, Hannah felt something new, a quiet sense of purpose she hadn't known before. She wore the locket every day, the cool metal resting against her heart like a reminder, steady and comforting. At school, as she tackled tests and college applications, it was as though Margaret's courage lingered with her, and Mr. Saunders' faith in her carried her through each step. One crisp Saturday, she returned to Mr. Saunders' house, this time alone. She had felt a need to visit, a pull to see him again, as if something unfinished still lingered between them. She rang the doorbell and he answered almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting her. They sat in his living room, the same warm light filtering through the windows, though autumn had deepened, casting the room in a gentle, golden glow. Mr. Saunders poured tea, just as he had before, his hands a bit shakier now, but his gaze just as clear. "Have you decided on a college yet?" he asked, settling into his chair with a smile. Hannah nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. "Yes, I got accepted to a couple of places already," she said, hardly able to contain her enthusiasm. "One of them even has a program in education. I thought about becoming a teacher." He beamed, pride and joy shining in his eyes. "Margaret would be so happy to hear that," She always believed in the power of teaching. The way it shapes lives, his voice softened. It's a path filled with kindness, you know. Every lesson, every moment of patience, those are gifts you give. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the light shift and change as it streamed across the room. And then, as though it were waiting for the perfect moment, Mr. Saunders spoke, his voice softer now, as if he were sharing a secret. You know, Hannah, he began, his gaze distant. I sometimes think about the people who pass through our lives, the ones who show up in moments we least expect. I never had children, never had someone to pass things on to until you. You gave me something precious, a piece of hope I thought I'd lost. Hannah felt tears gathering. Though she held them back, her heart too full for words. It was a rare and beautiful feeling, knowing that her life had intertwined with someone else's in such a profound way. Margaret taught me, he continued, that a person's worth is measured not by what they take from the world, but by what they give. And Hannah, I want you to know you've given me more than I could ever repay. He paused, his eyes glistening, as he looked at her with a tenderness that felt like family. Hannah reached out, placing her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a long moment, sharing a silent understanding. The seasons turned, and with them, Hannah's life shifted. She prepared to leave for college, her heart filled with anticipation and gratitude. On her last visit before her departure, she and Mr. Saunders spent hours together, reminiscing about the day in the pharmacy, the tea they'd shared, the gift of Margaret's locket. When it came time to say goodbye, she found it harder than she'd expected. Mr. Saunders held her hand in his eyes soft but knowing. You'll go on to do wonderful things, Hannah, he whispered. Carry Margaret's kindness with you, and know that you'll always have a place here. She promised to visit, to write, to keep him in her life no matter where her path led. And as she walked down his front steps, clutching the locket that now held his story, as well as Margaret's, she felt a deep, quiet certainty. She wasn't just leaving for college, she was stepping into a life built on kindness, one small gesture at a time, carrying forward the legacy of two people who had shown her that generosity could shape lives. Years later, as she stood in a classroom of her own, guiding her students with patience and warmth, she often reached up to touch the locket, feeling the memories and wisdom of her journey. She knew, without question, that her small act in that pharmacy had led her here, woven her life together with the Saunders family in ways she could never have foreseen. And on the days she felt lost, she'd remember Mr. Saunders' words, a gentle echo reminding her that the worth of a life was in the giving.